top 10 most powerful elven warriors of all ages. Hello my lovelies. Today let us talk about the highest ranked elven warriors of all time. We will continue part 1 of the video linked down below with my number 5 to 1 pick. So if you haven't watched the first part, maybe do that now. And before we start, I would appreciate if you can leave a like and a comment, as this helps out the channel immensely. Thank you very much. Number 5 of the most powerful elven warriors. This was a hard one, by the way, because I wanted to place him higher, and you might disagree with me, is Finrod Felagund himself, the eldest son of Finarfin and older brother to Galadriel. He was a great and skilled hunter, and his weapon were bow and arrow, but he was also a skilled swordsman. If you remember the ring Aragorn was wearing, the ring of Barahir, this ring was originally Finrod's ring, given to Beren's father Barahir after he saved the elf's life in the Dagor Bragollach battle. Finrod was the king of Nargothrond, next to the hidden city of Gondolin. Nargothrond was the strongest elven kingdom of that time. The king came forth with a great army, but through treachery of former allies and the enemy bringing forth fire-breathing dragons, Finrod was outnumbered and trapped in the north. The king and his men fought on, but if not of the men of Dolomin aiding, they would not have survived. They were able to escape back to Nargothrond, but most of Finrod's family died in this battle. His uncle Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, his 2 brothers, Angrod and Egnor. It was a devastating loss for Finrod, and him and Galadriel were the last of the line of Finarfin alive. With Finrod, we have another element of power beside pure physical strength brought into the story. He had magical powers and used them in the quest for the Silmaril, his greatest and also final hour. Beren came to cash in the promise of Finrod aiding the line of Barahir in times of need, and together with a few men, the king accompanied Beren to reclaim a Silmaril from the OG Dark Lord Morgoth. I don't want to retell the whole story, but they got caught by Sauron's forces. Finrod disguised their group with his magical abilities and made them appear as orcs they had slain on the way. Most likely, he had learned these powers from the Maiar Melian in Doriath. She was his uncle's wife and queen of Doriath. Him and Galadriel had spent time there, and we know she at least taught Galadriel magical powers, and so I guess it's not unrealistic. Finrod learned some tricks from his aunt. Also, Luthien, Melian's daughter, used a similar magic, so it makes sense he wasn't born with these powers but learned them. Fighting Sauron with the power of song in the next untypical art of war, Finrod used to fight off the Dark Lord, and he held his own, as Tolkien says, but in the end was defeated by the Dark Lord, who after all was a powerful magic user and simply overpowered the Elven king. They were captured and Sauron killed them one by one, till only Beren and the Elf Lord were alive. Bursting his chains and fighting off and killing the werewolf with his bare hands, he managed to save his friend's life, but died of the mortal wounds from the evil creature. So Finrod was a great warrior, but also a powerful magic user. Although the power is not fully explained still, it added to his powers and abilities to fight off the Dark Lord Sauron himself. Number 4 people. His valor was as a fire, yet steadfast as the hills of stone. Wise he was and skilled in voice and hand. Truth and justice he loved, and bore good will to all, both elves and men, hating Morgoth only. He sought not his own, neither power nor glory, and death was his reward. Number 4 is one of my personal heroes of the First Age, and is no one else than Fingon, eldest son of Fingolfin, and hero of many battles of the First Age of the world. He was, like his father, a skilled and great warrior, and his weapon was a sword. Like all his siblings, Fingon was born in the Undying Lands. When discussing number 9, Medros, we talked about his cousin freeing him from hanging by his wrist at the Thangorodre mountain. That cousin was Fingon, and just one of his many good deeds. Even the fact his uncle's whole family slaughtered an entire city of elves didn't stop him from aiding them in fighting off the Dark Lord Melkor. He proved himself a capable warrior during the siege of Angband that lasted 400 years and brought on a time of peace over the lands. The peace was broken by Morgoth, introducing his weapon of mass destruction to the world and testing them on the Noldor princes and their armies. The Dag of Bragollach, the Battle of the Sudden Flames, ended the siege and ended in a catastrophe for the elves. The High King of the Noldor and Fingon's father, Fingolfin, lost his life. Egnor and Angrod, his cousin, lost their lives, and many of the elven strongholds fell after the fourth battle of the First Age. Fingon became the new High King after his father's death, but he wouldn't last long. In the fifth battle, the skilled warrior met his match. The strategy was to attack the enemy from two fronts, and Fingon's troop, so included the Elvens and the men of Hithlum, the elves of the Falas and the Círdan, the Haladin of Brethil and the army of Nargothrond front, built the western front. They were the smaller host, and the eastern front containing of the forces of Fëanor's sons were betrayed through, and Fingon, smelling the treachery, stayed in hiding, but again was driven out by mistake of men. The battle was a gruesome one, and Morgoth forced Fingon to retreat from the battlefield under heavy casualties. They fought valiantly against an overpowered enemy, fighting with dragons and Balrogs and all the evil creatures you can imagine. By the fifth day, a miracle happened, and Fingon's younger brother came in with 10,000 men from Gondolin and saved his brother and king. Just as the king wanted to retreat and save his people's lives, Gothmog joined the battle and forced the elven king to single combat. Tolkien describes the death of the elven king in the Silmarillion. But now, the western battle, Fingon and Turgon were assailed by a tide of foes thrice greater than all the forces that were left to them. Gothmog, Lord of Balrog's High Captain of Angband, was come, and he drove a dark wedge between the elven hosts, surrounding King Fingon and thrusting Turgon and Hurin aside towards the fen of Serech. Then he turned upon Fingon. That was a grim meeting. At last Fingon stood alone with his guard dead around him, and he fought with Gothmog until another Balrog came behind and cast a thong of fire about him. Then Gothmog hewed him with his black axe, and a white flame sprung up from the helm of Fingon as it was cloven. Thus fell the High King of the Noldor, and they beat him into the dust with their maces, and his banner, blue and silver, they trod in the mire of his blood. Fingon, a Balrog in single combat, leading armies through various battles, make the Noldor king a worthy number 4, I'd say. Number 3 is Ixalion of the Fountain. And high and noble as was Elmakil, greater and more lordly was Ixalion, Lord of the Fountains, at that time warden of the Great Gate. All in silver he was clad, and upon his shining helm there was set a spike of steel pointed with a diamond. And as his esquire took his shield, it shimmered as if it were bedwetted with the drops of rain that were indeed 1,000 studs of crystal. It is not clear if he was born in the Undying Lands. Judging his powers, I would say yes, he was. Ixalion, a Noldor elf warrior, lived in the hidden city of Gondolin, under the rule of his king Turgon, the later reigning king of the Noldor, after the death of Fingon. During the fall of Gondolin, he became one of the greatest elven heroes of all times, and his deeds were still praised by elves centuries after his death. His name even became a battle cry. How cool is that? The first noteworthy battle he fought was in the Nirnaeth Anodi at the Battle of the Unnumbered Tears. Another devastating battle for the elves and their allies, the dwarves and men. We know he was amongst the commanders of Gondolin's army, an army with at least 10,000 men, and he held one of the flanks so the army could retreat from the battle and flee back to the hidden city. His weapon was a sword, and most likely it was Orcrist. The later made even an appearance as the sword of Thorin Oakenshield. His armor was pure silver, and he wore a spiked helmet that would come in handy later. He was also the lord of the House of the Fountain, one of the 12 houses of Gondolin. His final hour, but also greatest victory, came with the fall of Gondolin in the First Age. Fighting alongside Tuor, the king's son-in-law, Ixalion managed to drive back Morgoth's forces that had already taken most of the city. The enemy had attacked without warning and came with Balrogs and dragons and all the evil creatures imaginable. Gondolin was one of the last stands of the elves against the Dark Lord, and the great city falling would be one of the greatest loss of the Eldar. Ixalion alone slew 3 Balrogs, but was wounded in doing so. Sadly, his sword hand was wounded, and he could no longer carry his weapon. They made their way to the square before the palace, where the king and the remaining forces of the elves took their last stand against the army of darkness. Ixalion was one of the last warriors standing, and even without his sword, and even losing his shield, he stood against Morgoth's greatest weapon, the Lord of Balrogs himself, Gothmog. Gothmog had slain kings and great warriors before, the mighty Fëanor and Fingon amongst them. But his winning streak would end against our hero of Gondolin. No sword, no weapon at hand. The wounded warrior drew his spiked helmet into the demon's body, and both fell into the fountain of the king, and drowned together. What an epic death for an epic hero, if you ask me. Number 10, and this is an elf almost all of you will know. The elves whose deeds in aiding fighting evil were so impactful that the gods brought him back to life and sent him back to the world of the living to continue his fight once more. And it is no one else than Glorfindel himself. He's amongst those who were born in the Undying Lands, and we have several descriptions of his great power coming from another world. My theory is he is from the line of Finwë, first High King of the Noldor, and he's the son of the youngest sister of Fingolfin and Finarfin, Irime. He came with a host of Fingolfin to Middle-earth, survived the gruesome journey over Helcaraxe, the icy wasteland, and stayed with the host of Fingolfin and his sons. Glorfindel was tall and straight, his hair was of shining gold, his face fair and young, and fearless and full of joy. His eyes were bright and clean, and his voice like music. On his brow sat wisdom, and in his hand was strength. After aiding Turgon, who I'd say is his cousin, in the Dagor Aglareb, he aided in founding the hidden city of Gondolin. He even became the lord of the House of the Golden Flower, one of the 12 houses of Gondolin. Glorfindel rose to become one of the greatest warriors and was amongst the captains of the kings. Together with Turgon, he fought in the Nirnaed Anodian and barely escaped with Gondolin's armies from complete destruction by the enemy. It wasn't due to the lack of the elves' capabilities in warfare, but rather the treachery of the enemy. Regaining their strength, Glorfindel and the Gondolindrim thought themselves safe in the city that was still hidden from the enemy at that time. But that wouldn't last. War came to Gondolin, and the city fell after almost all inhabitants were killed in an attack by Morgoth. The king died, but Glorfindel and his men fought valiantly till the end. Together with the king's son-in-law Tuor and his men, and the before-mentioned Ixalion, they built the last battalion fighting off Balrogs, dragons, and orc armies. When the king fell and almost all elven warriors were spent, Glorfindel aided the last survivors to escape the doomed city through the secret tunnel the king's daughter had built in anticipation of the city's impending doom. Shout out to Idril, by the way, my personal hero. Glorfindel and his men held the rear end of the escaping survivors. But this wouldn't be a happy end. An unnamed Balrog came at the fleeing desperate elves, and Glorfindel, wanting to save what was left of the Gondolindrim, including the king's heir Eärendil, stood between the fleeing elves and the Balrog and fought him fearless in single combat, and won. Sadly, this wasn't the end. The fall of Gondolin ended in the fall of Glorfindel. The Balrog, failing to his death, grabbed the elven prince's hair and dragged him with him to the grounds. Next to Ixalion, Glorfindel was only the second elf that ever managed to kill a Balrog. And then something remarkable happened. For long years he remained in Valinor, in reunion with the Eldar, who had not rebelled, and in the companionship of the Maiar. To these he had now become almost an equal. For thought he was an incarnate, to whom a bodily form, not made or chosen by himself, was necessary. His spiritual power had been greatly enhanced by his self-sacrifice. From the history of Middle-earth, the last writings, Glorfindel. As I mentioned, he was sent back re-embodied to aid again in the fight of the next Dark Lord in line, Sauron, and his minions, the Witch King, and the other Nazgul. His powers were even greater the second time. He was almost as powerful as a Maiar spirit, like Sauron himself was, Tolkien tells us. Glorfindel spoke the prophecy about the Witch King, dooming the Dark Lord's most influential servant. He fought in the wars beginning of the Third Age and settled with Elrond in Rivendell. One of his greatest moments came when he fought off the Nazgul and saved Frodo by bringing him to Rivendell. The Nazgul were literally shitting themselves because of the sheer power Glorfindel held. If he had been a great swordsman and warrior in the ages before, he now was of both worlds, the visible and the invisible world, and he had the light of Valinor within him, coming fresh from the Undying Lands, and therefore basically blinded the Nazgul with his power. And if it wouldn't be for one, I think, that was a mightier and braver warrior than Glorfindel, he for sure would be my number one pick. So, drumroll, Helen's pick of most powerful elven warrior of all times. It can be no one else than Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, eldest son of Finwë and Indis, and the only elf that ever managed to challenge and fight and wound the OG Dark Lord himself, the most powerful being in all of the world. As most of the other mentionings in my list, Fingolfin was born in the Undying Lands, and he came from the powerful line of kings of the Noldor. He was said to have been the strongest of the three sons of King Finwë, and his weapon was the sword Ringil. Fingolfin did partake in the kingslaying of Aqualundu. Coming in late, he did not know what happened though, and knowing the complicated history of him and his elder brother Fëanor, his lord and new king of the Noldor, I myself won't hold him accountable for this. Arriving in Middle-earth with the greatest host of elves, he established a realm near Lake Mithrim and became the High King of the Noldor not much later, after the death of his eldest brother Fëanor at the hands of several Balrogs. The dead king's eldest son Medros passed the crown to his uncle Fingolfin and his line. His first deed as the new crowned king was to besiege Angband for over 400 years, bringing peace to the lands of Middle-earth and letting all Noldorian factions settle and build strongholds against the enemy. Sadly, not only the elves geared up for war. Morgoth saw the elves never truly attacked his stronghold, and so he knew his time would come soon, and he would have the upper hand. He had bred monsters for centuries now, and was ready to strike against the Noldor princes. The dragon Glaurung was unleashed in the Dagor Bragollach, and the elves were slain by the thousands and burned alive. Fingolfin saw the mass destruction and his people dying, and knew this would end in a catastrophe for the elves. So he decided to end this by challenging the Dark Lord himself in single combat. I can't remember a braver deed of any elf ever told, and Fingolfin knew this sealed his fate. But he did not hesitate, and this for me doesn't just make him a great warrior, but also the greatest of all elven kings in my mind. Let's hear how Tolkien describes this unequal match of the century. Now news came to Hithlum that Dorthonion was lost, and the sons of Finarfin overthrown, and that the sons of Fëanor were driven from their lands. Then Fingolfin beheld the utter ruin of the Noldor, and the defeat beyond redress of all their houses. And filled with wrath and despair, he mounted upon Rochaloha, his great horse, and rode forth alone, and none might restrain him. He passed over Dornum Fauglith like a wind amongst the dust, and all that beheld his onset fled in amaze, thinking that Orome himself was come. For a great madness of rage was upon him, so that his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Thus he came alone to Angband's gates, and he sounded his horn, and smote once more upon the brazen doors, and challenged Morgoth to come forth to single combat. And Morgoth came. Fingolfin named Morgoth Craven, therefore Morgoth issues forth clad in black armour, and he stood before the king like a tower, iron-crowned, and his vast shield, sable, unblazoned, cast a shadow over him like a storm cloud. But Fingolfin gleamed beneath it as a star, for his mail was overlaid with silver, and his blue shield was set with crystals, and he drew his sword, Ringil, that glittered like ice. Then Morgoth held Lofgrond, the hammer of the underworld, and swung it down like a bolt of thunder. But Fingolfin sprang aside, and Grond rent a mighty pit in the earth. Many times Morgoth essayed to smite him, and each time Fingolfin leaped away. And he was wounded, Morgoth, with 7 wounds, and 7 times Morgoth gave a cry of anguish. Whereat the host of Angband fell upon their faces in dismay, and the cries echoed in the Northlands. But at last the king grew weary, and Morgoth bore down his shield upon him. Thrice he was crushed to his knees, and thrice arose again, and bore up his broken shield and stricken helm. But the earth was all pitted around him, and he stumbled and fell backwards before the feet of Morgoth, and Morgoth set his foot upon his neck. Yet, with his last and desperate stroke, Fingolfin hewed the foot with Thranduil, and the blood gushed forth, and black and smoking, and filled the pits of Grund. Thus died Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, most proud and valiant of all elven kings of old. There are many notable elves I forgot to mention. Let me know your top 10 picks. I'd love to see if I missed out on anyone. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I might consider doing this with men, but obviously including Numenorians as well. I think it will be a hard one again, but if you're interested in that video, let me know in the comments. Bye bye my lovelies, till the next one.